Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome again. For those of you who were bright and early, you've heard me say this multiple times. Thanks for bearing with us. It is 3 o'clock by at least one of my clocks, so I think in the interest of time, 3 o'clock Eastern time that is, I think in the interest of time, we'll get started to make sure that all participants have the opportunity to share, ask as many questions, hear as many things as possible during this community of conversation. Welcome again to the PDG Birth Through 5 Needs Assessment Guidance Community of Conversation with the Preschool Development Grants Birth Through 5 TA team. We are very thrilled to have so many folks that we see signing in this afternoon. Very glad that we can talk through the important needs assessment activity as part of your PDG Birth Through 5 grants and the needs assessment guidance that the PDG Birth Through 5 TA team has provided to grantees with whom we are working with closely. So we really look forward to talking with you about this topic and about the support and clarity that we hope can be offered to you as you pursue your needs assessment related activities. Just a couple pieces for a few minutes of housekeeping before we get started, as we do know we would like this to be as participatory as experience as possible. You'll see at the top of your screen, there is a little speaker button. If that is green in the top center of your screen, please go up to that and mute your speakers, and this will eliminate any feedback that we may get through your computer speakers during the event. In addition, participant lines will be muted for the majority of the event. However, when it either comes time for you to speak because called upon, you may press *6 to unmute your individual line and *6 to mute yourself back. When you are not speaking, if you can press that *6 to mute yourself back, when you've finished, that would be fantastic. So as again, to eliminate as much background noise and feedback as possible. What we encourage you to do, if there isn't a time when you're called upon by some of our PDG Birth Through 5 TA team members, if there is a question that you have that you would like to ask either virtually or via phone, we have a couple options for you to do so. In the bottom right of your screen, there is a Q&A pod in which you can type your needs assessment guidance targeted and specific questions that you'd like the facilitators to address today or try to address. Please know if there isn't time to address something during this call, we'll be sure that it is answered after the fact. No questions will be lost, but we will try to get to as many questions as possible provided during this event and those that folks provided ahead of time as possible. We have chat as well. That is an area where you can offer comments, feedback, words of encouragement, compliments, and other types of either technical or troubleshooting questions, but we encourage you to use the Q&A pod for your needs assessment guidance, targeted and specific questions. You may also, if you'd like to have the opportunity to speak via audio, raise your hand. Another option at the top of your screen, there's a little person, and you can choose raise your hand at the top of the screen, and we'll try to call on as many participants as possible who would like to speak their questions aloud. It's a little bit of an experiment. We want to make sure to have as many folks that can participate as possible, but we do know we have a lot of folks on the line. So while this will be participatory, we'll also see what works best, make tweaks if necessary for any types of similar meetings moving forward. And again, for anything that is not caught during our time together this afternoon, we'll make sure that it's addressed in another way, shape, or form. Nothing will be lost after the event. We encourage you to be in touch with your TA specialist or the TA team at the general PDG B-5 TA email address, and we'll provide that at the end of the meeting. With that, I turn it over to our facilitators for the day. Jim Lesko, our technical assistance lead, and Chris Botsko, a senior TA advisor.
So, Chris, I guess I'll go ahead and get started. So our conversation today will focus on the needs assessment guidance and planning. We'll also be planning communities of conversation coming up in the near future on strategic plan guidance. We anticipate that document to be coming out either later on this week or the beginning of next week for those of you who have been anxiously awaiting the next support document to help you in this important planning process. We have invited the PDG B-5 grantees. We encouraged grantees to include their partners and consultants. We know a number of grantees are working with vendors to help them in the needs assessment and strategic planning guidance, and we welcome all of those participants on the call today. We want to let you know that all of the PDG B-5 technical assistance team are on the line, and thank you to all of those members. I quickly call them out to you. Gori, Kesley, Maria, Maureen, Sammy, and Sue, along with Leah and Tanisha, who are expertly assisting us with this call today. Our federal project officers and regional office staff are not on the line today. So this is an opportunity for those grantees to have this conversation around needs assessment. So we welcome everybody that's on the call. We do have technical assistance partners from the State Capacity Building Center who are our technical assistance partners in this effort, and they are also a part of the conversation today. This is certainly a voluntary conversation. We are glad you are all here. We will have some questions for those of you, and of course we do encourage questions from those of you on the call. I have been in touch with a couple grantees who have made considerable effort in their particular needs assessment process, and they are aware. I'll be calling on them to share with us some of the work that they've done since they got this process started. So this will be, an exciting opportunity for you all to hear as well from your peers in this process. We'll have some select presentations and resources will be available. We will have a resource and repository site soon to be available to all grantees and their partners, so we look forward to that. As Leah mentioned, there are two opportunities for you to participate in this discussion today. One would be via the phone when that opportunity is available, and that would either be the best opportunity for that would be to raise your hand, so our expert team knows when to unmute yourself, or you can also unmute yourself by I think it's star 6. We'll put that into the instructions, and/or you'll have an opportunity to post questions in the virtual chat, and we'll be monitoring that chat box and raising those questions. I can also say that earlier when this invitation came out, that we asked grantees to submit some questions to us, and we did have a series of questions, and so Chris and I will be sure to get to those particular questions that grantees have also made available to us. Okay, so I would think we're about ready to get started. Chris, I think I'm going to turn this over to you.
Thanks, Jim. Hi, this is Chris Bosco, and I'm going to do a very brief overview of today's call and then go into the heart of it all. So the needs assessment guidance conversation approach. The first, we're going to start with an overview of the needs assessment guidance and requirements going to be a very limited overview. For those of you, I mean, everyone who is involved with the needs assessment, and I think this is true of both states and contractors, should have a copy of the PDG Birth through 5 Needs Assessment Guidance. If for some reason you don't have a copy of that, you can actually download it in the little attachments box, which is just to the right of the slide. So if you don't have a copy of that and you want one for this call, you can do that right now. So then after that, we're going to have some participant questions and discussion. And we're going to do grantees' experience with needs assessment work to date. I'm going to hear from a few grantees who've already agreed to share a little. And then we're going to talk very briefly about the needs assessment submission process, conversation takeaways, and next steps in closing. So I'm going to start by going to the needs assessment guidance and requirements. And if you have the guidance, then on page 3, there's where you start the domains and the key questions. And so there are a listing of domains, they're first thing starting with definition of terms. And one of the questions we've gotten in ahead of time, and one of the things that I know has come up in other places, so I wanted to address it right off, is do you have to answer every question on the needs assessment guidance? And we tried to address that question, and I think in the managing the scope of the needs assessment section of the guidance, which is on page 2 of the guidance, and it says that the questions below are really intended to help focus your needs assessment while meeting the project requirements. We recognize that it's not necessarily feasible for you to answer all these questions. And so there are a request that you complete answers for the definition of terms, the focal populations for the grant, which I'm just going to briefly go over, and the number of children being served domain. So the first 3 on that list on the slide, the definition of terms, including vulnerable children and mixed delivery system. How do you define this in your state? How are you defining it for the purposes of this needs assessment? The focal populations for the grant, who are they? Who are the vulnerable children that you're looking at in the state? What do they look like? And the number of children being served and awaiting services. Those are the questions that you have to address, all of them. And then for the rest, it says, cover at least one issue or area in your state territory under each of the other domains. And it says cover at least one issue. It doesn't say cover at least one question. I know some people have interpreted that to mean the question, but we were really looking at this in a broader way of issues which might involve multiple questions. Part of there's a little lack of specificity, and part of that is really just because we want this to be flexible to meet your needs. It's really about making a needs assessment that's as useful as possible for the context of your state. But it does need to be a little broader than probably one question. It does also suggest that as you do this, make sure your focus descends beyond the ECC system to multiple other early childhood systems, since they play an important role in providing needed resources for vulnerable and underserved families. So, as I said, the first 3 lists of the first 3 domains in this list on the slide are ones that there is an expectation to kind of answer all the questions. For the rest, there's flexibility, and a good part of that flexibility is based on what your needs are. There really is an interest at both the TA level and the federal level to make sure that this needs assessment is really something you'll find useful, both for this grant and in the future as you think about what you want your system to look like. So, kind of resuming the discussion in terms of what the domains are, there's quality and availability. So that includes early childhood care and education. It also includes programs and supports needed for any strategy to address vulnerable children. So that includes some things related to ECC, all related to ECC in the sense that these are programs and supports that are really important for the children you're serving in your ECC programs and beyond. So Gaps in data are researched to support collaboration and maximize parental choice is another domain. Measurable indicators of progress planned and or in development is another one. Issues involving ECCE facilities. So what are some of the issues in your state regarding facilities? How are you addressing them? What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? Things like that. Barriers to the funding and provision of high-quality ECCE services and supports, and opportunities for improvement. So the needs assessment includes a look at what's getting in your way of providing high-quality ECCE services and supports, and that could be at any level, and what are your opportunities for improvement. Transition supports and gaps. There must include a focus on transition to kindergarten, but it was, as suggested in the questions, other transitions can also be important. One of the ones that I think comes up regularly is the transition between early intervention and preschool special education. So while you could do a needs assessment that doesn't address that, there are lots of reasons to do a needs assessment that does address that, and I think it's beneficial to you in terms of kind of both talking about your system and in terms of kind of completing a thorough needs assessment. And then system integration and interagency collaboration. How are the different agencies that work in early childhood working together? What are the challenges there? What are both the positives and the issues that arise there? So that's the list of the domains, and so we're going to open it up to questions in terms or comments or interesting approaches related to the needs assessment domain to start with.
So this is Jim. Chris, and I would say the first question that we had, or one of the questions, is will there be a needs assessment template or another form for reporting the final needs assessment? And I would say the answer to that particular question is simple. There will not be a template that will be recommended for states to use. There are a variety of options for states to be able to report their needs assessment information. I could say a couple things about that. One, there will be a memorandum coming from Richard Gonzalez's office at ACF indicating their preference would be that the submission of the needs assessment include an executive summary of the needs assessment document. Specifically, within that executive summary is a request that states identify specifically within their needs assessment where the federal office can find or identify their attention to each of the 8 domains. So where there is specific information related to, for instance, the focus populations in the grant, within the executive summary, Richard is asking that states identify on pages 5 through 10, the state has provided specific information related to the focal population. Or within the executive summary, the state may say, please refer to attachment A or attachment B to find or to identify our data related to the focal population. There isn't one specific document that's being required, and states are able to provide the executive summary, a broader summary document, and then include a series of attachments if that is the best way for states to be able to submit their needs assessment. But to go back to the original question, there is no specific template.
Thanks, Jim. And I believe that Andy from New Mexico has raised his hand, and if he could press *6 and for his comment or his question, that would be great.
Hi, folks. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're coming in quite clear.
Okay, great. I think my question or comment was partly addressed by Jim, so thank you, Jim, and that there's no template. But this will be helpful. This is helpful for us to discuss this before we get too far into our needs assessment. So I'll ask the same question, but maybe in a different way. We were planning on our needs assessment around some, we were calling them system areas that probably will result in different sections of the final report. Some of the systems areas are things like governance, both state and local, access, and how successful are we at getting, reaching our populations, quality and workforce, and not around these focus areas. We didn't have them at the time, nor when we released our RFP for a vendor. But I think I'm hearing, but it will be helpful to hear you say it again, that the structure is not being defined, i.e. you said there's no template. So we can structure our needs assessment to meet our state's needs. But am I also hearing that if we do that, we would need to give the feds a crosswalk back into these domains, that you will find local populations addressed in this section, pages da-da-da, and this section also on the following pages. So I think I'll stop there and sort of, is that what I'm hearing? We can basically structure the report or the needs assessment product how we want, but we would need to give some sort of crosswalk to the people looking back on these, whether we met these domains. Is that right?
This is Chris, and Jim, you can kind of chime in, but I think that's absolutely correct, that there will be an expectation that you do the crosswalk, but you can structure it however is beneficial to you, and as long as you're addressing the questions and can show that in the crosswalk, then that's acceptable and a good way to approach this.
Yeah,
Jim, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I was going to say, just remember that the domains were taken directly from the funding application. So every state will want to make sure that they address those domains in their needs assessment. But again, Andy, as you said, and Chris mentioned, the federal government wants you to do the needs assessment that best benefits the state and the identification of what those needs happen to be. However, in their criteria that they're going to use to make sure that the state addressed what was in the funding application, a crosswalk of some sort in the executive summary or in a separate document, however the state chooses to establish and provide that crosswalk. That's what will be most helpful to the federal offices as they review the needs assessment documents that are provided.
Okay, that's helpful, and I think just one follow-up comment is that I think this is helpful to be looking at these now, because some of them may end up being we're early enough in the process that some of these could actually be sections or appendices to make the process of reviewing them, and we could actually use this, some of this language, the domain language, so that makes it easier. But it sounds like there's a lot of flexibility, but again, the plea is for states to make it, I don't know about as easy as possible, but straightforward for the reader to be able to see that each of these were addressed.
Hello?
So
You're right on
thanks,
target.
folks. I'll put myself back on mute. Do I just put *6 to mute again?
That's correct.
Okay. Thanks, guys. Appreciate the call.
Hello?
Hello.
Hi, this is Jimena Franco from North Carolina. I have a question. question. So just to clear it up, the 11 domains that are specified in the federal guidelines, it is up to the state which ones are we going to be reporting on those. But for example, if there's a specific domain that perhaps we might not be able to respond to all of the questions because there's currently work underway, is that something that should be established on the report? So should we at least touch on these domains as to say, this is where we are, these are the identified gaps, this is where we're going, and these are the identified gaps, there's currently work underway, but no results at this point?
Yes, that is, you don't have to address every question, but you do have to address every domain, and if what you can say in the domain, and this question actually came up in some of the pre-questions we received in relationship to, let me check 1 second, in relationship to the measurable indicators question. So some states said that as of now, they don't have measurable indicators, or they're not sure what measurable indicators they're using, and they're going to decide that in the strategic planning process. And that's perfectly acceptable. And in order to kind of meet needs assessment criteria, you would essentially explain that. You would say that you have a process underway to develop measurable indicators for this grant. If there are measurable indicators that others have used or that you've used for other reasons, and you want to talk a little about that, that may be helpful as context and other things. But that it is perfectly fine to be able to say. I mean, I think you definitely have to address each of these domains, but saying that that you're looking at it through the strategic planning process, or that after doing some research you have decided that this is not necessarily a focus of your grant of your next steps at this time. So some states said they're doing a needs assessment process, and transitions are not coming up as a problematic issue. You can essentially say that. You can say that we did this needs assessment process. These were the issues that were identified. Transitions do not seem to be a problem, and explain that. Those are all acceptable things. You have to discuss the strategy, but you have to discuss the domain. But if those are ways of discussing the domain and what you're going to do about it, or the reasons why it's not a major issue from what you can see at this point in time.
That is great. Thank you so much.
And I don't know if you wanted to add anything on that, Jim? Any other questions? Has anyone else come up?
Yes. Sorry, Chris. I had myself on mute. We have a question from Reva Murphy. And Reva's question is, will we be held to consistency with defined terms and identified populations included in our original proposals, or can we revise as we move through the needs assessment process?
That's a good question, and I think that the expectation was that your proposal was your best thinking at that time, and if during the needs assessment process you find that your best thinking at that time needs to be modified, that is perfectly reasonable thing to do. If you think it's useful, you can explain. You originally thought this was the population you wanted to focus on, but for a variety of reasons, you're now moving to this one. But I think, realistically, there isn't necessarily going to be a direct comparison. There's really going to be a look at, whether what you're saying about the identified populations, about vulnerable populations, in your needs assessment makes sense and is consistent with the data that you present at that time. So yes, you can go ahead and revise it if that seems warranted. Thank you. And thank you for the question. It's a good question. I don't see any questions or hands up at this time.
We can always go to one of the questions that we received previously prior to the call. You ready to do that?
Yeah.
Sure. So one of the questions is, can you provide more clarity on the measurable indicators domain? Is there a standard for the number to have? What are some examples? If our state does not currently have measurable indicators, do we need them in our needs assessment? What if setting measurable indicators is a part of the strategic planning process? How should we address that in the needs assessment?
And we had kind of started the answer, part of the answer. We've already provided part of the answer to the question, but not the whole answer. And so, yes, if you're going to do it as part of the strategic planning process, it's very useful and important to explain that. I don't think there's a standard for the number to have. I think it's really a question of having measurable indicators that you think kind of cover the key areas that you want to focus on. So it'll likely vary from state to state. It's also sometimes an issue of data availability. You may, as some of the questions I think in some of the questions in the needs assessment guide address this, you may say that there's an area we're very interested in. The reality is we don't have very good data on it. Part of what we like to focus on in our strategic plan is taking steps to develop better measurable indicators. That's a perfectly legitimate thing to do, and I think something that would be considered very positively for a grant like this and for future work in this area. So I think part of the expectation is that there's a data development piece of this. So that kind of covers the number of questions that were asked about it.
Great.
I know we had a question. Go ahead, Jim.
I was going to say, Stephen Hicks has asked a question concerning the evaluation criteria of the needs assessment, and this was also one of the questions we had received previously from another state. His question was, they've answered all the questions in the first 3 domains and at least one theme in each of the others. Will there be a rubric of some kind with a score attached? And that's very similar to the question we received previously. The addition was, is there a passing score? And I think to initially respond to that, there is not yet a scoring criteria. There will be a review tool that Richard Gonzalez's office will be releasing in the near future that his and his staff will use as in the process of reviewing to make sure each state needs assessment addresses the domains that have been outlined in the funding application, and at least one or more of the questions related to what was in the needs assessment guidance. So now at this point there's not a passing score. It's much more of a qualitative review of the state's needs assessment than a quantitative review. So, go back and pay attention, I would say, to the guidance and look at the domains and make sure it's clear in whatever document or set of documents that you're going to submit that they address each of the domains, that it's easy for the reviewer to see a path within the submission document or documents that you provide so that they can clearly see where you've addressed each of the domains. And I think you'll be in great shape. Reva did say, and I think this is an easy follow-up, the question was, is there any requirements or guidance on length? And to our knowledge, there's been no guidance related to that. So nothing around the length of the document.
And Deborah asked the question, similar question to Reva, some of our thoughts on needs assessment questions, content, and methods have evolved. How close must our final document match the application? And I think that's similar to the question we had gotten a little earlier. And I think that the answer is really, there isn't going to be a check on the consistency between your application and needs assessment. The needs assessment really is going to be judged as a standalone document. And if it's useful to explain why your question content methods have evolved, that's fine to do so. It's not necessarily something you have to do. It really is a question of making sure that wherever you've evolved to just meets the expectations of the needs assessment as defined in the guidance, not whether it matches what you said in your application. And I'm going to do the next set of slides and then come back to questions while we have a chance here, and partly because it kind of is a segue into a few of the other questions we got. And this is kind of a keep in mind slide. So some of the things about the needs assessment. And, it's to ensure the needs assessment is comprehensive. I think, one of the things here is compared to some projects and federal government's requests and times when you have to do a needs assessment, this is a fairly well-supported needs assessment, so there is an expectation that it's fairly comprehensive needs assessment. Adopt a systems focus regarding the mixed delivery system and early childhood systems and supports. So look at all the things that vulnerable children in particular may need. Use existing assessments and reports, but make sure you cover all the requirements. And something for that, there are lots of existing needs assessments out there. So even if you're doing a process where you're getting feedback from people, it's still oftentimes useful to look at reports. And this kind of came up in the context of we had a question about transitions and a state saying that there weren't transitions weren't coming up in the process they had developed around their needs assessment. It wasn't coming up in their data collection. And I think, one of the things they could do, we did a brief search afterwards, and one of the things they could do, there were a couple reports in that state that were focused on the issue of transitions, and there were some findings from those needs assessments and studies, and you can bring those up. You can use previous needs assessment discussions, and if data was collected, you can bring that up in your current needs assessment and say, this was found in this prior needs assessment or this program's needs assessment, and we're kind of taking that as something we're taking that as part of the data we're using when we analyze for the needs assessment. So I think that's fine to do that. It's important as you're doing so to make sure you just kind of hit all those components, as we said multiple times. Gather input from a wide range of stakeholders. There's an expectation here that this is a conversation that extends to providers of services, that it extends to parents and families and things like that. So however you do it, and you can do it in a variety of ways and through a variety of options, there's just, it's good and useful both as a needs assessment strategy to gather input from a wide range of stakeholders. And the idea here is to ensure that the needs assessment clearly informs your strategic plan, so that when you're done, you won't just put this on a shelf and not look at it. You'll be looking at this as you do your strategic plan to say, our needs assessment identified this as an important issue, and therefore we're going to address it in our strategic plan. Or possibly, our needs assessment said that we don't think that this is one of our priority issues at this point, so we're not necessarily addressing that. Or we because of limited resources, we may need to address things related to this one a little later on. But the idea is that the needs assessment clearly informs the strategic plan. So we were going to ask them for the experience to date and how's it going, but we may have gotten another question or two while I was talking. I'm not sure. So Reva asked if the guidance required domains seem more focused on the mixed delivery system than the broader EC system. How are states thinking about balancing those two arenas? You know, is the ECC being considered as support to the mixed delivery system or as a broader and somewhat connected support for families? And, you know, I think that the intent here is certainly this is a grant that is designed to help address what you do in your ECE system, but I do think there is also a real recognition that in order to serve vulnerable families, you have to think about the broader EC system, and that you have to look at support programs as well in some cases. And how you balance that, I think, partly depends on the work you do within your state, what you see as your kind of critical issues, how you work things out with partners, and I think, you know, it'll be interesting to see how different states are doing that. I don't know whether we want to hear from some of the states who had said that they were going to talk a little about their needs assessment strategies, and they might be able to provide some insight into how they're addressing both this issue of balancing and some of the other issues we've talked about so far. And Jim, are there particular states?
Sure.
I know.
Yeah, I'm actually thinking Sue Polajak. To see, you said you were going to sign on. I see that you're on. Maybe this would be a good time if you'd be willing to talk about the perspective that Pennsylvania has used in exploring the issue of mixed delivery and the broader EC system, because I know that Pennsylvania has thought about this over the past several years, both as a recipient of the challenge grant and now with the B-5 PDG work. Sue,
Great.
are you willing
to
hear
me?
Talk about that a bit? Yes.
I am. Can you hear? Okay, great. Yes, so I would love to share some of our our process. And so, you know, our strategy for the PDG was to aggregate the results of our existing data in order to fully address the FOA. And then we did draft an introduction and defined our assumptions and definitions. And so at the core of our needs assessment, it was informed by our office's Reach and Risk program assessment, our Keystone Stars revisioning process, our QRIS, which we did through Race to the Top, our Head Start needs assessment through TANF office data, and the maternal, infant, and early childhood home visiting needs assessment. And so through looking at all of that data, we fulfilled that requirement prior to submitting the funding request. So we felt that because we've had all of these systems in place and we have, you know, so many different bureaus and programs under OCDEL, that we felt that we really had, you know, all of the existing data that crossed all of those systems. At the same time, you know, we've been collecting this data for over 10 years. And so that really helped us think about, you know, what the needs were, and then informed our strategic plan. At the same time, whenever you talk about, you know, the diverse group of stakeholders, we, you know, our governor right now, Governor Tom Wolf, is very he's very vocal, making sure that all of our offices engage stakeholders at all times. And so our Early Learning Council, who is the group of folks that we go to, you know, most often to be able to share out, you know, our thoughts and to make sure that we're aligning with what our, you know, stakeholders in the Commonwealth are thinking about. And so we did provide them not only our needs assessment, but our strategic plan, took back their guidance to make sure that, you know, it was aligning with what our thoughts were, looking at all of the domains and really making sure that we had, you know, all of that information crosswalked. So that was really our that was our plan of how we did that.
Great. Thank you so much, Sue. I appreciate
Sure.
willingness to be on today. And I guess, did that address the question around looking at the population?
It did. It did.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Sue.
Sure.
Let's see. I'm going to get to a couple other questions. Or does anybody, before I do this, is there anybody who's on the call has some specific questions for Sue before we let her go back to mute? I don't hear anything, Sue, so thank you very much. Chris, a couple questions have come in while Sue was sharing. So before we go back to a couple other states, one question was a few of our most valuable prior needs assessments are several years old. Is there a window within which we should keep the results still current versus possibly stale?
I mean, my perspective on this, and I think it varies by what you're looking at, is that, I mean, oftentimes there are a lot of programs where you're asked to do a 5-year needs assessment because the idea is that after 5 years or so, the information you put in your previous needs assessment or your 5-year strategic plan things have changed enough that you want to go back and take another look. You know, I think certainly anything that's 1 or 2 years old would be considered perfectly reasonable and not particularly out of date. When you start getting in past that to 3 to 4 and 5, that's when I think you have to start asking questions. And part of it will depend on, I mean, if you've had tremendous demographic change in your state, or things were already in flux and you've had a reorganization or something, then you may decide that, you know, maybe this isn't as relevant as you are. I think you probably have lots of experts among your partners to draw upon to say, you know, I just don't feel comfortable including that anymore because I'm not 100% sure it's no longer accurate. So I think it's you know, it's a partly dependent on what the issue is, but it also, once you get, you know, I think the 3 to 5 range is when you start to ask the question of, is this something we should keep in, or is this something that maybe we should take another look at? And I know we got a number.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jim. I know we've gotten a number of questions about sharing of data and issues related to that. And I know we've had some discussions about this internally, both about that and about integrated data systems and how to approach it. There are some great resources out there for looking at some of these issues that have been published because of the interest in this as a result of the Race to the Top grant and other things. And we're certainly your TA specialists, and we've been sharing them and talking about them. We're also looking into other ways to address issues around data, and it'll probably be the subject of some information we'll be sharing in the not too distant future and some possible webcasts. But if you have specific questions about that, it is certainly something you should raise with your TA specialist, and we can have discussions about how best to share that information while we wait for something more global that will enable us to share things with the group as a whole. I don't know if you have anything to add on that, Jim, since I know you have a fair amount of experience with that issue.
Yeah, no, great response, Chris. We are in conversation with some subject matter experts that specifically have experience with addressing things like sharing data across departments and agencies, privacy issues, and governance. And we will be hosting similar communities of conversation, and Chris mentioned webcasts, specifically addressing these issues, because we know that that's an integral part of being able to get at the data that you need to have. This is also probably a good opportunity. Cody Somerville from Texas, they have been doing, they have actually done an outstanding job of bringing together large data sets as a part of their needs assessment process. And I don't know, Cody, I think I see perhaps the Texas team is on the line. If you want to spend a few minutes talking about, if you can, what data sets you explored and how you're bringing those data sets together for a part of your state's analysis. If you want to hit star 6.
Yeah, happy to share. So we started working really early on, actually at the end of December, but even before we were awarded the grant, on trying to figure out what we would do in order to get the data from our agency partners. So just a little context about Texas. We have 7 state agencies that have programs related to early childhood education. And so we started working with our research and analysis division, and due to the amount of time required in order to execute data sharing agreements, they advised us to go with data that we could essentially get through a public information request from our agency partners. We didn't end up going through a PIR formally. We just reached out to program staff at these other agencies and talked with their data staff as well, and they gave us data sets that they would be able to release to anyone who asked for them. So they did run the data based off of a data template that we provided to each of our agency partners. And to create that data template, we initially asked our agency partners to provide us with their data dictionaries and their data layouts so we could see across agencies what data fields they had available. And then we looked at kind of our research questions and which of those common data fields would be most helpful to have data around. And so we have data aggregated at the county level, and it provides counts by demographics, but we don't have individual level data. We also had to recognize that each of our agencies has different data masking rules, and are having to be cognizant of that as we're working through the analysis of the data. Given the time frame, obviously, we had to sacrifice the quality of data in order to execute the needs assessment in a timely manner. So a good part of our appendices is going to be some of the challenges that are presented with the data that we have available. And so we got data sets from all of our agency partners, but the other thing that we did is we are using about 30 different existing needs assessments and are having our vendor do a meta-analysis or a meta-synthesis of those 30 needs assessments to begin to answer our research questions. And then we will use the state agency data to supplement the meta-analysis. And then we've also done stakeholder surveys where we got just under 9,000 stakeholder responses, and then we have some focus groups planned here in the next few weeks. So we're using all those different data sets as well as the American Community Survey data from the Census Bureau to inform our needs assessment.
And this is Chris. Can I ask a question since we had gotten this question? For that, are you using a single contractor for your needs assessment, or are you using multiple contractors?
We're using one contractor.
And will they also be working on the strategic plan, or will they will someone else be, or will you be doing that differently?
We will be doing it differently.
Okay. And that kind of segues into, we had gotten a series of questions about this. So we've had a request from a couple states to look at RFPs that were issued in order to find a strategic plan, not a needs assessment contractor. And we would love, for those of you on the phone, if you have RFPs that you can send, it would be great if you sent them to your TA specialist. And then we'll figure out a way to share them with other folks who are interested. But so we're very interested in your RFPs for your needs assessment at this point. But also, if you have a strategic planning one, I think some other states would love to look at those and see how you approach this, and it'll help them think about how they want to approach things, both in terms of finding contractors and in terms of seeing what's out there and the approach that different states have taken. And I realize we're kind of coming close to the end of our time, and one of the things we're kind of discussing as we're doing this is that we probably should have put it 90 minutes for this, and we'll take that in as something we've learned about this in terms of community of conversations, and take that into account for next time. I did want to make sure that we shared this slide, which is the needs assessment submission process, and I think Jim did a very nice job of kind of talking through a little of it earlier in a response to a question. But you know, in terms of the process for when you feel like your needs assessment is done, or if you feel like you've got something that meets the needs of this project from previous work, then you should take your needs assessment, complete it, and check it against the guidance to make sure. You should develop a crosswalk with the requirements completed. You know, one thing that's optional is you could seek input from your TA specialist. So if you would like, your TA specialist is available to kind of take a look at what your needs assessment draft and provide you with their perspective on you know, how it looks in terms of kind of the guidance, or if you have any specific questions related to that. They will do their best to help you think about that and help you raise questions and ask questions about it. Sometimes I think it's always helpful to get a look from someone who's familiar with the topic, but not necessarily your specific needs assessment, and can provide you some feedback in that regard. And then you should submit your needs assessment and crosswalk to your federal project officer, and in that tiny little print there, CC to Richard Gonzalez and your TA specialist and regional program manager is recommended, just so that the people who are involved can kind of see that. And I know Leah just answered a question that a repository for PDG B-1 through 5 information and resources is upcoming, and that's a good, both a good question and something that we're working on in terms of where resources like this could be available and people could see what's available. And I realize we have actually come to just about 4 o'clock. I don't know if there's any last things you want to add, Jim, or things that I missed. You want to go through the next in closing?
Sure. Just a quick comment, too. I also, John Roden and from Kentucky and Stephen Hicks from Maryland were prepped and ready to share today, and I'm sorry. Well, first, thank you for being willing to share, and I'm sorry we ran out of time. Hopefully, perhaps we can repeat this or extend this a second time if there seems as though it was a great opportunity, lots of great questions. Our next steps in closing, as I mentioned, the strategic plan guidance will be out within the week or so. I would look forward to coming out most likely the beginning of next week. There will be continued communication through your federal project officers. Also, we do encourage you, if you have some specific questions, to work with your TA specialist through Atlas. We are also, just a shout out to the State Building Capacity Center as we continue to work on with them and partnering. We are in the process of setting up specific peer-to-peer opportunities, so to have one state has specific conversations with a partnering state. We've already had one state request that, so we're willing and happy to make to facilitate that process. ACF and education and our other TA partners will continue to share, and we are working with many of our national TA partners in making sure you have access to the critical information that you need. We will have additional, as we mentioned, virtual ongoing communities of conversation, and has been mentioned, we will have a resource and repository site for our B-5 grantees. That'll be up and running, so keep your eyes out for that. Let's see. We will make sure that we get to any questions that we have not responded to. We'll work to get you a response to those questions that we ran out of time for today. And I'm looking to see if Leah has any other comments. Are we good to go? We're 4:01. Great conversation. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. We were over 100 plus participants. We glad you were here, and hope you found this a valuable experience. And
Thanks, everyone.
Yep. Thanks all. Have a great week.